I'm going to talk to you today about jQuery plugins and how to keep them warm and toasty in a warm Backbone coat. So how many of you out there use Backbone.js? Okay, okay, got it. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about jQuery plugins, what they do, and how to use Backbone most effectively with them. Quickly, I'll start off by, I think the camera's on. Let's see what happens. I'll start off by talking about who I am. So my name is John Paul. I used to work for Condé Nast up until very recently. I just moved to a company called Penton Media. If you were all in New York, where I live, I would be trying to hire all of you. So if you want to move up there, let me know. I love JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that allows me to write things that my parents can actually see, and that's been a lot of fun. I just tweeted my slides. So if you want to follow, I tweeted them at the conference hashtag and the conference Twitter handle. So if you would like to follow along, there will be code here. This is about Backbone and jQuery. So if you want to follow along on your machines, it might be a little easier. I just tweeted all of them. Here's just a link in the browser you can take a look at. So first off, I'd like to start talking to you about invention. So we don't normally think about ourselves as engineers, as inventors. We think of ourselves as the graybeards, not the mad scientists. But actually, we are inventors. We sit there every day, sitting in front of a computer as engineers, deciding how to invent a solution to problems that our product managers, our users, and our user populations or consumers come up with. And what that means for us as front-end, so how many of you write front-end code regularly? Okay, so I'm a front-end engineer as well, and I feel most of our days are trying to come up with solutions within the browser to build widgets that have probably existed before that chances are you don't want to write. Many developers come at the problem of, I have a new problem, I need to find a solution in two different ways. Some people like to start from absolutely nothing. They like to start from the bare bones of jQuery. They like to start from even Zepto because jQuery is too crazy for them. Then they like to build up everything from the minimal layer of toolkit and framework that you can possibly have. And other people, other engineers, attack the problem of, I have new things to develop with, I want to build on the shoulders of giants. I want to take what is out there, I want to make that work with the application that I'm building, I want to make that work with the code base that I'm building, and I want to make something better. Realistically, so depending on, there's a whole spectrum here. Some people like to be extremely meticulous over writing everything and making sure that nothing was not invented right here with them. But in the end, we all have deadlines. And when we have deadlines, we really have to eventually come up with something that will allow us to build the user interfaces that we need to build within the timeframes that we actually have. And usually what this means is relying on freely licensed open source code that's out there for us to take, bring into our applications, and build on top of. Also, I'll say, so if any of you use this toaster, it's the coolest thing ever. You should definitely try it. It makes your eggs for you. Just make sure you use some Pam, because it gets really nasty if you don't. But we are actually inventors, and we should think about ourselves that way. What do we use typically when we want to invent for the front end? It's pretty often that we don't go to these low-level pieces. We go and look for jQuery plugins. jQuery plugins are the Swiss Army knife, the multi-tool of the front-end developer. There are so many different jQuery plugins already out there that do so many different things that chances are your users need to do in your application. There are calendars and modals and galleries, date pickers, autocompletes, charts, maps. The list goes on and on. There are approximately 3,000, 2,000 to some more than that, plugins on plugins.jQuery.com in case you ever want to check it out. jQuery plugins were some of the first things I ever wrote on the internet. It felt like that was a pinnacle. It was a turning point in my life to say, now I can actually build something that I can share with other people that someone might actually want to use. Don't ever use it. It was a horrible thing that I wrote. But it really did work, and it was ununit tested and all of these other things, but I was very proud to be able to put it somewhere and say, people, download my jQuery plugin. It solves this little particular use case for you that you might actually have, and chances are 2 or 3 people that all worked with me did that. And that was fun. So the actual jQuery motto itself is write less, do more. jQuery, the whole goal of jQuery is to make sure that you don't have to worry about all of the nitty-gritty things about cross-browser issues, but rather you can take jQuery and build on top of it. Similarly, all of these jQuery plugins that are out there and freely licensed, you don't have to worry about understanding how enough cartography and SVG to build a map. You don't have to understand all of the all of the potential edge cases in building up a carousel, like I'll be talking to you about in a few minutes. But all you have to do is take these jQuery plugins and build them into your applications. But how does that actually work? Actually using plugins, if you ever go to a jQuery plugin documentation site and you try to you copy this zip file down, unzip this JavaScript file and stick a script tag into your application or into your code base, what this ends up meaning is I need to then write as a jQuery plugin user lots and lots of configuration. You can basically copy and paste lots and lots of lines from all of the different documentation sites that say, I want to use my carousel that has these configuration options, or I want to use a map that is in Mercator projection, and all of these different options that you need to litter your different code base with. And all of these pretty complicated options are stuck into one big object literal that you can then configure to your heart's desire. The jQuery plugin API doesn't actually care, and jQuery plugin authors are usually very liberal in saying, if you want to configure anything on Earth, we will give you an option for it. And this is actually a good thing. Adi Asmani has a blog post about jQuery plugin patterns, and there's 15 or more jQuery plugin patterns, and they all have very drastically different approaches. You can write a jQuery plugin using jQuery UI widgets, if that happens to be your cup of tea. You can write them using the require.js and widget factory. You can write them using typical Java-style inheritance or prototypal inheritance. There are so many of these different patterns if you go online and look and you want to copy and paste something to start building a jQuery plugin. But looking at this, there's a lot of complexity here that is masked over by the fact that everyone just wants to use a jQuery plugin. It's a really good thing because each of these jQuery plugin authors, they don't have to care. They can make anything that they want that fits with their framework. So what this does is, if someone's using require.js, they can just pick that and make a jQuery plugin that you can use on your own. And it floods the jQuery plugin market with a lot of these things that we can use because each of these developers can just make something that fits their current framework. They don't have to worry about making something match an external API or an external way of doing things. So it's a very good thing that there are lots and lots of these different patterns. But on their own, a jQuery plugin is not particularly very far from the spaghetti mess that we're all sort of running from when we want to get away from the jQuery's the jQuery normal mode of development, which is select some things and do things with it. Select some elements and add click handlers, select some forms and add some submit handlers. When we want to move away from that, really we're ending up with spaghetti. So the other thing I'll say is I want to apologize. There's a lot of carbs in this talk, and I know that lunch is coming up in like an hour and a half or 2 hours or something like that. So in case you're hungry, feel free. There's probably sugar somewhere in this building if you want to go and get that fix, but there will be more carbs coming up. And I don't have water up here. Well, anyway. So I'm going to start talking to you about, so this is my spectrum of toast. My spectrum of toast from one end, so my personal preference toast is I am a second row, last column kind of toast guy. I'm going to be talking to you about how to take jQuery plugins, wrap them in Backbone's view structure, and be able to write very, very nice, clean abstractions over Backbone so that you don't have to worry about all of the different, all of the complexity that a jQuery plugin might introduce. And we'll slowly walk along this spectrum of toast until we get to my perfectly toasted, nice, warm jQuery plugin. So enter Backbone. So I asked a little earlier, there's about, I don't know, 5 to 10 of you that have used Backbone before, so I'll go over a little bit of what Backbone does. Backbone is a very, very small library. It has a few components to it that allow you to make applications within a browser. It has a models collections, which are basically pieces of JavaScript that allow you to easily access data and manipulate data with change handlers, so you don't have to write specific code in the jQuery or plain JavaScript style of updating pieces of data every time something changes in an input box or something like that. It also has the concept of a router, which says when a particular URL is hit, Backbone will allow you to call some code that changes state on the page. So it has the models and it has the controller. It does not have the controllers of MVC. It has models and the router. And the most important thing, the thing that I'm going to talk about today, is Backbones have a view framework. And what Backbone views do is allow you to write a very nice abstraction over particular widgets, and that's what I'll be talking about right now. So in whenever we build an application, this is a screenshot of the Yahoo homepage from some months ago. We look at this, and usually from a server-side rendered perspective, we can look at this and say, well, so here's some HTML that defines this, here's some HTML that defines that, and here's some HTML that defines other things. But really, as client-side developers, when we look at this, there are very distinct pieces that need to be controlled with JavaScript on their own. For example, this box on the left side has potentially some of its own tracking systems or its own click handlers that need to handle more than just clicking on links. Additionally, over here, there's this weather system. There needs to be some JavaScript that controls, am I in Celsius or am I in Fahrenheit? Or which city am I showing at any one given time? Even though originally all of these pieces of the page were rendered from the server side, there needs to be some JavaScript that controls each of these little sections. And what Backbone's views do is allow for a really nice way of setting up JavaScript code that maps to particular elements and widgets that are on the page. So I'll be talking to you a lot further, and the reason why I came up with this talk in the first place is because I was doing a lot of work using JCarousel. JCarousel is a jQuery plugin that handles this carousel-y section right here in the middle. That is something that needs to say, when you click on the left arrow, what should happen? What is the DOM element that has the right arrow in it? Should it auto start and auto go through? So how many of you have used carousel plugins? Because I'm just... OK, this is like the most common plugin I feel on Earth. I've used them 1,000 times. I've written them badly myself, so don't Google for them or anything like that. So what Backbone views allow you to do is write some code that looks like this. Here's where it gets actually into the code, that allows you to define certain views. And those views set up a widget initialization, so it allows you to say, Backbone gives you a way to say when my widget starts up, so when my page loads, for example, and already has some server-rendered HTML, what can I do with those DOM elements? Here, I can set up that I need to, in my initialize function on line number 7, I can do some things with the DOM, like figure out how many photos that I have, maybe use that somewhere later as I need to figure out what distance to move left and right every time I need to go through my animation. However you need to handle that, Backbone allows you to do something when the widget starts up, which is predominantly for me when the page starts up. Additionally, it gives you a really nice domain-specific language, or it gives a very nice way of defining event binding. So this line numbers 4 and 5 right here is what's called the Backbone event hash. So rather than doing the usual jQuery style of select some DOM elements and then do something with it, you can nicely separate that out to say, when I click on left arrow, call this function that has a nice semantic name. It's not inline that just says, suddenly do some things inside of JavaScript. Call this thing that is called move carousel left, which any new developer or and yourself 6 months from now can obviously go and see what this particular piece of code does. So Backbone views give you widget initialization, event binding, but really, overarchingly, the biggest goal of all of what Backbone provides for you is some organization. Normally, when you're just living in the jQuery front-end world, when all you have to do is select some elements or make some AJAX calls or all of these very low-level things, there's no particular place you have to go to in your JavaScript code that says, I have this carousel that's sitting here on my page. Where do I go look for all of the code for that? It could be anywhere in your scripts.js file, and then one day later you get a little hipster and you realize everyone's renaming that to main.js. So you move all of that code to main.js, you commit it, and you feel so proud of yourself. But really, I've done this 12 times, so don't think I'm picking on anyone. That doesn't actually give any more organization. Backbone's goal is to say, when I have a particular piece of DOM on the page, where do I go and look for that piece of code that maps to that? And what Backbone allows you to do is put that in one little place right here, called this, in this particular case, center photo carousel view. So I've just started introducing Backbone. There's definitely a much wider breadth of topics around Backbone, but I'll be talking about Backbone views. But since this is a fairly close and comfortable group, what questions do you have? Anyone? Yes? I'm sorry? OK, so the question was, where is my move carousel right? And that is off the scope of the page, so it is because I did not write it. But it would be right there under line number 10. What other questions do you have? OK. So the question was, is Backbone based on Spine or vice versa? Backbone and Spine are actually unrelated in terms of code base. Spine is a CoffeeScript, maybe subset. I actually have never used Spine, but they're definitely not related in terms of code. So someone, Alex McCaw, I believe, wrote a very similar thing to Backbone in CoffeeScript that has, I'm assuming, some slightly different abstractions, but they are not the same code at all. They are, I believe, unrelated projects, but one is inspired significantly by the other. Okay, so we have that thing, that little piece of modular code called a view. And that view is how we express specific code related to one particular piece of the page in Backbone world. But what does that mean when you actually want to add a jQuery plugin into your Backbone? So usually what that means is throw it all into initialize. So everything that you used to have in that big piece of JavaScript code in jQuery land that used to live inside of your scripts.js file, all that happens when you first start using Backbone is moving all of that code directly into what is initialize. Initialize is the code that runs when Backbone starts up, when your widgets start up. So in this case, everything just gets copied and pasted inside here. But so all of that configuration option hell that we needed to move around before now gets stuck in one particular place, which is a little bit better. But really, all this is moving the spaghetti that was in outside, and it's moving it into one particular place that's still pretty difficult to understand and pretty difficult to reason about. So we are slowly moving across the spectrum of Toast. We have made our jQuery plugins a little bit more encapsulated. We've added this layer of a Backbone view to know, okay, so at least I know when I want to use a plugin, I'll be a jQuery plugin like jCarousel, I'll be in one of these carousel views somewhere. But this is not at all as good as we can get. What's wrong with this? We've already moved some of the jQuery land code into a Backbone view, so we have a little bit of encapsulation. But at the time at which we need to make another carousel, because chances are in whatever application you have, there will be 10 autocompletes, there will be 15 carousels, there will be 9 different maps. There's not one particular, usually there's not just one use case for any one given jQuery plugin in your code base. So now what would happen is if I needed to make a left carousel view or a right carousel view or something on a completely different page that has a name that is a little bit beyond my tongue right now, we would have to move all of these configuration options with our nice Backbone views all around our code base. And it ends up with a very, very similar problem to the original, which is I have so much configuration, I don't know what to do. So what is the fix here? We can start off by thinking about not repeating ourselves. We can separate the details of what it is like, of the abstractions around I want to make a carousel from the specific view that uses that carousel. So here, I'm now making a generic thing called carousel view in Backbone land. And what that generic thing called carousel view does is specify particular, when that initializes, it gives all of the different configuration options for my plugin. So every time I need to actually use it, if you see here on line 14, I can just, center carousel view is just an instance of my thing called carousel view. And carousel view hides all of the actual setup for my jQuery plugin. This is a very nice pattern because it moves all of the configuration spaghetti from all of the individual places you might use a plugin, like the left carousel, the right carousel, the first name autocomplete, the user autocomplete, into one particular place like a Backbone initialize. Another thing that I want to mention here is underscore default. So how many of you use underscore JS? Okay. So there are a lot of things in there that most people do not know about. And I don't know about most of them. But every once in a while, I come across something, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I've written this 1,000 times myself, and I wish that I had known this existed. Underscore.defaults is a great utility inside underscore that allows you to pass in an options object and a default option object so that in case some things are not passed in, so in the case that auto true is not passed in, the defaults object will override everything for you. So rather than manually writing a loop that says if this exists, assign it, you can just use underscore.defaults for that. But when you have large configuration objects in JavaScript, like for example for jQuery plugins, it's very useful to be able to specify defaults like this. So again, we're moving along the spectrum of toast. We moved from completely jQuery land in scripts.js. We moved things into a backbone view, suck it inside of initialize. And now we actually made a specific backbone view to encapsulate the idea of a carousel. So backbone views give us these low-level pieces of organization to say, I have a view in Backbone. That view maps to a particular DOM element. Now I've added the ability to say that particular DOM element represents a carousel inside of my code base. So now what's wrong? It seems like we've gotten pretty good. We're getting closer and closer to where we want to go, and we have much better encapsulation over our code than we did before. But now we are actually stuck in a lot of rigidity. Now all of our code is, we have specific carousel views that are instances of this carousel view object that have all of the information about how to set up and actually initialize a carousel, make it go left and right inside of our application. But we've then tied our entire application to this particular thing called JCarousel. Because you can see right here, I have these configuration options. I have all of these, the way that this starts. I have different pieces of code that throughout my application know that I'm using this special thing called JCarousel. So something new will always come along. This is next to taxes and death from Ben Franklin. Change is the next thing that we're always required. For engineers, it's also bike shedding, but I don't know how far we can go with that right now. So the original reason why I came up with this whole idea is because I was working on a pretty long-lived project that was all about photos and slideshows and carousels, and there were dozens of these very specific carousels throughout my application. And my product management team came up with a great idea that to modify the carousel, to do something with the carousel that was actually a great idea and I really wanted to do. And if I had just picked this other carousel plugin that I could have just copied and pasted from plugin.jquery.com, my life would have been so easy. I would have been one configuration option away, and everything would have just worked when it come to what the business goals that they wanted to address by my new carousel thing to get people to click on more ads and whatever, things like that. But I didn't make that decision. I made the mistake of copying and pasting all of this configuration, just like I showed you earlier, across all of the different across the whole application. So if I wanted to integrate this new jQuery plugin that had this one feature that everyone really wanted and should have been really easy, I would have to sit there and rewrite hundreds, if not thousands, of lines of code. So something new will always come along, and we should be trying to write our code using the abstractions that allow us to change out implementation below. And what that actually means that we're going to do is first talk about design patterns. So there are lots of different opinions out there about how to learn about JavaScript design patterns, or even if they're using. How many of you have read a JavaScript design pattern book? Okay, yes, this is a common trend. I've read them as well. I'm sort of in the camp where design patterns on their own, learning about observer and visitor and strategy and all of these particular names, it's very interesting intellectually, but I always need applications. I need a place where I can actually utilize this, and then it sort of becomes clear. So here, we're going to start talking about a particular design pattern that we can use to address this particular problem of rigidity and tight coupling between my jQuery plugin and the way that I've built up my Backbone application. So to do this, I'll first start off talking about a car. So this is what a car actually looks like below the hood. I very rarely think about this, gratefully, but this is all of the constituent components of a car. If I had friends that I hated and I really wanted to get this car going, I could have someone sit there with a spark plug and a lighter, or however that needs to work, and actually make the spark plugs go. I could have someone sit there on the axles and make the car go. But realistically, I don't even want to think about this. I don't really know how all of this works. I'm not a car person. But I know that down there somewhere this nitty-gritty has to happen. But what do we like looking at? We like looking at a nice dashboard. We like thinking at this higher level interface, this abstraction that allows us to not know that when I push the gas pedal, that really there's something happening with a fuel line that's opening up, and there's something happening with a spark plug that fires a little faster or something like that. I like knowing that I can just look at a nice speedometer rather than try to guess at how many spins one of these wheels are making. So we like thinking at a higher level of abstraction, and this is a design pattern in and of itself, although one we don't normally think about. But it's something that we use all the time. This is called a facade pattern. The facade pattern is a way of writing a higher level interface, something that makes more sense to us as engineers, as us as people, to gloss over all of the stuff that exists below. So we actually use facades all the time. There are lots of these in our daily engineering life as we write front-end code. In Backbone, there's two big ones. The Backbone model save, which is a utility in Backbone to allow you to easily make AJAX calls against some backend and post and get data. Backbone.history is a very, well, it is a pretty good abstraction of facade over all of pushstate. So pushstate, how many of you have used pushstate? It's the browser location thing. Okay, so there is a way in modern browsers to control the URL of what you're looking at without actually refreshing the page. This is through an API called window.pushstate. So you can say, I want to push a URL that's /user/1 without actually having to refresh the page to /user/1. This is a very complicated, convoluted API that I have never gotten to work correctly, and Backbone.history helps a lot with that. Although the only thing I've actually gotten it to work completely correctly is Ember, which I'd love to talk to you about after. But there is a talk immediately after mine about Ember, so please go to that and you will learn a lot more. So Backbone.history is a piece of code that allows you to not think about a lot of how pushstate works. The most interesting example out of here is, I think, document.ready. So we all use document.ready all the time, so I'm not going to raise our hands. So the way that document.ready works, the goal is call my func at the time at which the document is ready. How does jQuery do this? It's not something that you would normally think of, because they need to support old browsers. And in new browsers, there's nice, easy events to pay attention to this. But in old browsers, what they need to do to make this work is actually an insane hack. What they do is, and as soon as jQuery loads, they continue to try to scroll the page programmatically by, in a loop, calling document.scrollTop and trying to set it. And the only time at which it does not throw an error is when the document has loaded. This is a crazy hack that none of us want to write. It is a crazy hack that I would reject in any pull request that ever comes across my way. But it's the only way for the jQuery team to actually reliably say that the DOM is ready across IE6 and up. This is a piece of code that none of us want to think about. No one wants to know the dirty skeletons and closets about how our browsers work and how we can write good cross-browser code. What we can use is this nice, easy interface, this nice facade that says, I have this function called document.ready. It will be called at the time at which I need it to be called. Additionally, there's $.ajax, which abstracts over the old Microsoft model and the new XHR model of how to make AJAX calls. And then input.val, which we also use all the time. It actually works on both form fields that just have text boxes, so input.value, but it also works on select boxes, so it knows how to transform what you're trying to set as a value to this really complicated option selected index mapping. jQuery handles all of this for you. So what are we going to try to do now? We're going to try to build a facade inside of this small little application that I've been talking about. So how do we figure out what are the important pieces that we need to facade over? Any particular jQuery plugin has many, many different options. But we need to be thinking about which parts differ in our application that we can then coalesce into our own API, our own facade, into what we need to actually be using. And this fits into 3 different categories, and I'll go into them. The first one is, do you need external configuration for your plugin? Does each of the individual instances, does the left carousel versus the right carousel need to have some special configuration that needs to be different for each of them? The second one is, does each of these particular backbone views need some external control? Should there be some way to say from JavaScript that a button over here needs to move the carousel to the right or to the left? And the third thing is there some proxied event that needs to happen? For example, if an animation starts, should that throw some event that some other JavaScript in Backbone land needs to think about? These are the 3 potential areas in which you can facade over a jQuery plugin inside of Backbone code. So for the example of needing external configuration, there's the few of them that I've already talked about. I need some selector that says, what should the element be when I want to move to the left? What should the element be when I want to move to the right? next to previous, and should I auto start this particular, should I auto animate through this particular carousel? So what this means in terms of code is this. Here I'm making a carousel view that actually maps the names very differently. Rather than using JCarousel next, which was the name of the configuration option originally, that I actually passed to the plugin right here, I am mapping it to a different name. And this name here does not have anything specifically to do with the particular plugin that I'm using. This just has something to do with the idea of having a carousel. So here I map my new name. Additionally, you can actually, when you're writing these facades over jQuery plugins, you can write completely new names. I look at the name auto, and I think that doesn't really mean something to me. In my application, in my code, I want us to use the word auto start because it has a little bit more meaning within my application. You can do that inside of this kind of facade. You can say the API that I want to have externally is auto start, but I will then pass auto to my plugin sitting somewhere. So writing code like this, you can take the configuration options that you want and map them into the configuration options that the jQuery plugin needs. So the next one is, do you need external control? Do you need to be able to write JavaScript that makes the plugin do things like move to the right or to the left? And the answer is probably yes, and I'll show you how to do that. In this case, I'm talking about how to start and stop the animation, or how to move left or right a certain number of elements. So this is really easy. Backbone views allow you to create arbitrary functions on them. And arbitrary functions can then be called on each instance of the particular carousel view that you're talking about. So here I've just written some functions, move right, move left, start and stop. And all these do is proxy through however the API for the plugin that you're using is. In this case, move right means you call this thing called move with one. And you can see from here that I'm just mapping all of the names that I want to have control over externally to the particular functions that the jQuery plugin provides. And here what's important is that I'm not defining all of the options that the jQuery plugin provides. There might be 150 other actions that I could take. I am only specifically defining the ones that make sense to me for my application. So with proxied events, if I want to say something like when a slide starts or when a slide ends, or when the animation starts or when the animation ends, or similarly when I'm using a autocomplete library, if I want to know when someone has selected, they've typed in partial name and they've selected the name John, there's some event that fires that says a tag has been selected, I can write code like this inside of my initialize that specifies that when I can define some new functions every time I create a new view that can be called on slide start or on slide end every time I go through every time one of these events actually fires. So I'm going to speed up a little bit here. So once we achieve these goals, complexity is significantly more hidden. We're not writing all of our code to be specific to the jQuery plugin, but we are writing our code to this nice high-level facade, this interface that we actually care about, which are just the specific little pieces inside the plugin that we need to actually use. There might be many more options that we don't have to pay any attention to. So this allows us to be a lot less sensitive to change when new plugins come down the road. So what that actually means when we write this code is, let's say I want to switch out to new carousel. If I want to switch out to new carousel, I already have 150 instances of this carousel thing throughout my entire code base. I don't want to go to all of those places and change them. So if I want to switch to add some new feature that's specific to some new plugin that I just switched out, what do I have to do? Inside a few different places, I have to make a few different changes of code. Here, let's say that the name of the configuration options have changed and auto became immediate. I just have to change inside one place in carousel view's initialize function. I have to change one name or a few names right here. And then if I want to change the API for how the new carousel moves left and right, maybe it doesn't use data, but it actually calls a function on the jQuery element. Again, I can just make these changes in one particular place, change how move right, move left, start and stop work, and I don't have to go and change in all the different instances in which I've actually used this backbone view. And additionally, for events, I can change however this needs to work, the names or the types of events. I can change all in one particular place, sitting inside of the one carousel view that I have, rather than all of the different places throughout the application. So for a second, I will talk to you about the law of Demeter. So the law of Demeter, I don't know why it was named this. I don't know who Demeter is. But basically, when we are writing code, we should be thinking about, so one, I also have my obligatory cat GIF, my cat video. You have to have it somewhere in a presentation. The law of Demeter is the principle of least knowledge. That's the better name for it. It's the name that actually makes sense. When you're writing your code, you should be thinking about every piece of code that needs to interact with something else should know the least amount possible about what that code can do. So in this case, when we're building up our backbone facade for a jQuery plugin, we only need to be thinking about the pieces that we need to be using in the application. We only care about moving left and moving right, and we only care about auto-starting animation. So those are the only pieces we consider at the time at which we're building the application. Similarly, when we're using all of these views throughout our application, when we want to make the 15 different carousels, we only want to think about using the pieces of the carousel that we need, rather than knowing that there are all of these other options. I'm sorry that I'm going to change the slide away from the cats. I really am. I see the disappointment on people's faces. So I think that I got to my goal. My goal was getting to the piece of toast that I liked best. Feel free to move this arrow to whichever one you feel is most butterable at any one given time. Now we have a jQuery plugin that is wrapped with a facade with a backbone view that allows you to specifically use the pieces that you want in all of the different instances in which you use that jQuery plugin throughout your application. We can then change our jQuery plugin or the backend at will. If you want to rewrite this thing entirely with custom code, you can do that without worrying about having to make changes throughout your entire application. What I want you to take away from this is jQuery plugins are a necessity. Building on dependencies are a necessity. We as front-end engineers are always thinking about what we can take off the shelf and build on top of, because none of us really have the time to sit there and write all of this code. Take from the web platform, figure out what you need to customize, and once you do, think about the configuration, the control over the widgets that you need to have, and the events that the widget might throw. Build these things into your facade, and then you can make sure, so here's my obligatory non-cat animated GIF. You can make sure that you don't have to be worrying about all of the sensitivity to change that applications inevitably come across. Because as you're building larger and larger applications, more and more change will come more quickly, and you don't want to end up like this guy taking from the bottom of a stack of champagne cups. So I have some resources here if you want to learn a little bit more about jQuery plugin patterns as well as backbone architecture. There's a guy named Derek Bailey who you should definitely follow if you're interested in these things. He writes a lot about how to best organize and structure backbone applications and how to utilize other code within them. Thank you so much for your time. What questions do you have? I'd love to hear them. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Okay.
And where we struggle is that backbone views, they end up with a lot of memory leaks.
Mm-hmm.
So is there any neat way to clean up your backbone views and models in a native way?
Sure. So the question is there a nice way to clean up backbone views because of memory leaks? So what I have done typically for this is not handle the view rendering process myself, but rather use one of the frameworks for it. So Backbone Marionette, for example, which is written by Derek Bailey. I don't know if any of you use that. There are libraries that will take care of that for you. Doing it manually is a lot of manual tracking of things. So I would recommend that you use one of the frameworks out there that will automatically handle memory and zombie views and things like that for you. What other questions do you have? So are you really hungry now? No? No? There's toast. Okay, so thank you so much. Definitely let me know if you have any questions. We'll talk.